What is wealth? Why shouldn't the government own stakes in corporations? And what are some non-market problems with tariffs? I'm Dominic Pino, economics editor at National Review, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from Scrooge McDuck's vault of gold coins, so if you hear any quacks, that's why. Wealth, it's something that we talk about a lot. Some people have a lot of wealth, other people don't have as much. People generally want more of it. And politicians really want to talk about taxing it. But what actually is it? To answer that question today on the podcast, I have Richard Stern from the Heritage Foundation, who wrote a really good paper on this subject last year. And it's not as easy a question as you might think. And I think really once you dig into what wealth actually is, it helps to illuminate a lot of different things about economics and how the economy works. So thanks so much for being here, Richard.
No, thank you so much for having me on and highlighting this topic. I agree with you. Obviously, it's a crucial foundation to anyone's understanding or conversation about economics, and I wish more people talked about it.
Yeah. So let's get started. What is wealth? We think of wealthy people as people who have, a lot of stuff. They might have like a fancy car, they might have a yacht, they might have, fancy watches or something like that. And that's usually what people think of when they hear the word wealth. And of course, that's true. I mean, rich people do have those things, but what is wealth? What is wealth in general?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And, we've all seen the meme of Scrooge McDuck, from the old cartoon in a vault with tons of cash. And, you'll see articles written by people all the time saying, if we could just redistribute the wealth of the wealthy, we could do all these amazing things. What they're missing, and my short answer is, wealth is really the physical tools we have to produce things. It's the factories, the roads, the delivery trucks, the TV you have that you watch, your favorite show on. All of that are physical wealth. All the financial wealth that we have a sense of, your bank balance, your stock portfolio, all of that is a capture of real physical things that are actually used to produce all of the things that we enjoy in life. And that's really what it is at the end of the day.
Yeah, and so when we see that somebody's wealth is represented by a number, right? If we always see these rankings of the wealthiest people in the world, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, those kind of people. And we see this big number next to their name of 200 billion or whatever their wealth is. And we think like, oh man, they must have like a bank account somewhere with like $200 billion in it. Just like, I have a bank account with, a couple $1,000s in it. Right. But that's not what that number actually means, right?
Oh, absolutely. So, let's start small. Let's talk about a restaurant franchisee, somebody that owns a Chick-fil-A, right? You might say, that Chick-fil-A, that they own on the corner of the street is worth $1 million, the building. And you might look at them and say, they own that. Maybe they own a home. They've got 20% down on a mortgage. So their net worth is pretty close to the value of the Chick-fil-A. Now, you and I, and most people would say, well, there's no $1 million to redistribute. It is the Chick-fil-A. Now, you could say nobody should own a Chick-fil-A, and I'm going to force that guy to sell it, take the $1 million, and hand it to Mom Donnie to run a socialist welfare program in New York City. But then we'd all know that, that means that all of the workers of that Chick-fil-A, they've now lost their jobs. The people who go there and get food, they've lost a source of food. Now, if you scale that up, that's really what wealth is. When we talk about Elon Musk being worth $400 billion, what we're talking about is his ownership of a piece of those companies, of SpaceX, of Tesla. When we talk about Jeff Bezos' wealth, we're talking about the sliver, and really it's only a small part of it, of Amazon that he owns. So again, if you wanted to say, well, let's just use that for the public good, you'd have to destroy the business. You'd have to get rid of Amazon. You'd have to fire all of those workers. It would mean that no one could use those services. And that's really what it is at the end of the day. That number is a capture of your ownership of real businesses that these people have worked hard to produce, that employ real people and produce real goods and services that all of us use.
And so currency and the dollar in the United States is a measurement of wealth, but it's not wealth in and of itself. And I think that's a really important point to bring out because it's been something that's been talked about by economists since at least Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, where he talks about how a country's wealth is not how much gold it has or how much, which at that time would have been the international currency that they would have talked about rather than dollars. That's not what wealth comes from. What wealth comes from is the stuff in that country that matters for people's quality of life. And dollars are good to have because they allow you to buy those things, but they are not themselves the wealth. They're pieces of paper, or today they're bits in a electronic account.
Absolutely. If I gave you $1 billion, if I put this poll on Twitter and I said, I'll give you $1 billion in cash, right? But I'm going to give it to you on a deserted island. You'll have no radio. You'll have nothing else. It'll be you on the island with $1 billion. Guess what? No one would take that deal. Now, don't get me wrong. There might be a few takers, but they would take it in hopes that they would be rescued and brought back to civilization where, as you pointed out, they could cash in those $1 billion for real things. And at the end of the day, that's what the purpose of an economy is. It's to produce the food on the table, the clothes on your back, the roof over our heads right now. And the cash, the money, which, as you pointed out, cash is less than 10% of all of the assets that we actually talk about just in America. And all of that is there to serve as a way of being able to exchange, expend your labor and get paid, and then cash that in for food and rent and etc. And so at the end of the day, the people who are chasing cash, who are chasing just gold or Bitcoin, that's a way of convenience of exchanging these products. It's not, as you pointed out, the thing we're looking for. What I'd say is we have about $90 trillion of something called capital stock in the U.S. And this is one of my favorite things. Everybody talks about GDP. What's capital stock? Look out your window. It's the value of every building, highway, factory, car. It's the cost to have made all of that. When people talk about inherited wealth and whatever, every grocery store you've ever walked into, every road you've driven on, the roof over your head, this is the inherited real wealth of a nation, taking thousands of years to build and the knowledge it takes to put these things together and in good use. That's real wealth. And I agree with you. And, that's one of the lessons that Adam Smith tried to teach 250 years ago.
So you mentioned the capital stock is $90 trillion, roughly in there. And just for perspective for listeners, the U.S. GDP is around $28 trillion. So it's significantly larger than the GDP, which seems sort of counterintuitive at first. And then there's another measurement, which is the net worth of all the United States households, and that's even larger than the capital stock, right? So can you explain a little bit the relationship between those numbers?
Absolutely. So, if you think through your financial investments, we're all accustomed to the idea of return on investment. So I've put some amount of money down. What do I get back as a passive return on it? Well, GDP is the value of all of the stuff we produce. Again, the food on the table, clothes on your back, the roof over your head. You can think of that as something of the return on investment of all of the fixed assets we use to produce it, the factories that produce canned soup, the construction equipment at a site that's used to assemble a home. Now, of course, and it's about a third to one, which would be 33% would be a great annualized return on investment. But that's with your labor as well, right? When we talk about a financial investment, it's what you get passively. GDP is the active return on investment we all get when we go to work, just enjoying living in your home and in your living room as opposed to, frankly, being in a field with no structure at all. So that 90 trillion is the tools we have that we can apply our labor to and have all the richness of the goods and services we have abundance to. Now, to your next question, what is financial net worth? Now, most people are like, well, it's my stock portfolio, my bank balance, whatever. But what I will tell you is financial net worth of the country is about 70% more than that value of all the physical stuff. Why? It's because the value of our economy is greater than the sum of its parts. So think through if you had a blast furnace from a steel mill in your driveway. How valuable is the blast furnace? Well, you're probably not using it in your driveway. And so maybe you can sell it as a blast furnace or sell it as scrap metal. But where it is in a steel mill is more useful because it's in the mill with all the other equipment, with the rail lines coming in. So that 70% premium is reflective not just of the value of the stuff we have, the factory equipment and offices, it's that extra value beyond the sum of its parts of the beautiful way in which our entrepreneurs and innovators bring together the physical capital to give us not just a warehouse and robots, but Amazon. Not just a blast furnace and a rail line, but a factory that produces things. That's what that is.
I think this is a really vital point. It reminds me of what Arnold Kling calls patterns of specialization in trade, which is this idea that the economy, all too often we think of the economy as these stocks of stuff, right? So we have GDP, which is all the stuff we produce. We have capital stock, which is all the stuff that we use to produce that stuff, and that's good and important to think about. But the real value from those things comes in how they interact with other people and how people figure out ways to arrange those the individual components of those big numbers into things that are productive and useful for people in their everyday life. Like you were saying, like as a simple matter of accounting, you could go around and add up the total value of individual pieces of equipment, but those pieces of equipment might not be useful if you don't have any people who know how to work them, or if you don't have other pieces of equipment that complement them and that make them valuable in order to produce stuff. And that is really where wealth comes from. It's that interaction of human beings putting together those different physical things, and it happens in such a way that no person could ever plan it in advance.
Oh, absolutely. One of my favorite stories, and if anybody has seen the movie The Founder, is about the story of how McDonald's came to be. And, if you're familiar with the movie, where they come in on the story is actually late in the history of McDonald's. It's a story of how Ray Kroc turned it from one restaurant into the national franchise. But actually, what I want to get into is something even before that, which is, a lot of people don't know this, but White Castle is a lot older than McDonald's. Now, the reason I bring this up is, a lot of people sit down and say, oh, I could run a business, or I could figure it out, or I could innovate and whatever. I want to highlight this story to show you and everyone, watching and listening, I think exactly how, frankly, complicated it is to arrange and innovate these useful things. So White Castle's older. They figured out that people like hamburgers. And, what does White Castle offer? Even to this day, a bag of burgers. What White Castle didn't quite figure out was what to offer with the hamburger. Now, today we can say, well, it seems easy, but no one at the time in the 20s and the 30s, no one had figured it out. What the McDonald's brothers did is before they had what we think of as McDonald's, they had a restaurant. They were good cooks. They were popular in town. They had something like 40 items on their menu billboard at their drive-in restaurant. If you go look at old photos of it, it's like a bingo board of food options. But because they had so many options, what they noticed was that something like 85% of their sales were just what you think of: fries, milkshakes, soda, and burgers. And so they got this information from the market through sampling that no one had figured out. Frankly, even they hadn't figured it out. It's that the market spoke to them through these subtle interactions. They were willing to listen to it and reform their entire business around it. And in fact, they produced exactly one new piece of equipment, and it's the little thing that squirts out the mustard and ketchup. That's it. All of that innovation was listening to the market, listening to the fine edge of what people really want, and actually just recombining tools that already existed to make the difference between McDonald's, White Castle, and everything else that existed at the time. That's the beauty of it and the complexity of it.
Yeah, we talked about that in a previous episode of the podcast. I talked about Fred Smith and FedEx, who just passed away recently. And, he didn't invent airplanes. He didn't invent delivery trucks. He didn't invent cardboard boxes. He didn't invent packing tape. He didn't invent any of that stuff. All he did was he was able to arrange that stuff in a different way than people had before and provide something of value that people didn't even know they wanted, which was overnight delivery. people didn't even realize that would be a valuable thing that people would want. And Fred Smith didn't even realize that it would be, because initially he just thought this would be a good business idea for, high tech companies, medical companies that need stuff overnight. And certainly those companies do use FedEx, but also so do the rest of us. And by starting that network and starting that idea, he was able to create a lot of wealth, not just for himself, but for everyone else who uses FedEx every day.
Absolutely. And, again, this gets back to a lot of people think about progress, as technology, that there's an inventor who invents something and that's the end of the story. But I think, what you and I know is that that's really the beginning of the story. There's a million of these things like that are invented, that someone discovers some scientific principle. And many times it's even hundreds of years later that actually gets operationalized in a way that benefits our lives. Today, almost everything we have to owe about our material prosperity comes from the Industrial Revolution, the ability to harness energy that doesn't have to come from a human directly or from animals. The first practical steam turbine was invented 2,000 years ago in ancient Egypt when it was under Roman occupation. And at the time, there was this toy. It was this little spinning ball. You put water in, you had a fire under it, and steam came out and made the ball rotate. And who would have thought of the, almost infinite, breathtaking number of ways you could use that to alleviate suffering and poverty, to uplift people? And they couldn't imagine it. And it would take 2,000 years of struggle to figure out how to use these things. Fireworks and compasses, there are things like this that were around for hundreds of years before innovators put them to good work. And so, there's a lot of over-reliance from people to say, well, we'd invent these things anyway, who cares? But that fine edge of what is valuable and not, what makes people's lives better and not, lives in these minor details in an innovator's head. There's no bureaucrat that can make up for that. There's no government mandate that can do that. We have to let innovators be able to dream and work and tinker.
And you also can't tax that wealth and try to give it to other people, right? This is a key point, I think, from your paper that you talk about. A lot of times, I think part of the problem comes from how different wealth looks for ordinary people versus for extremely wealthy people. So, you have a chart in the paper where you talk about how, people who are, really like the bottom half of wealthy people are people who are in the bottom half of the wealth distribution, I should say, in the United States. So this includes lots of middle-class people. Most of their wealth is in real estate and in durable consumer goods like cars and things like that. And you could think about that in most middle-class households. They might have the equity in their home. If they've paid off their car, there's wealth in that. There's wealth in the stock portfolio that they might have, but that's about it. And that is the bulk of their wealth. Whereas for really wealthy people who are billionaires, almost none of their wealth is in real estate or is in consumer goods, and almost all of their wealth is in their business that they've started. Can you talk about just how different is that picture for people? Because I think when we think of people who are not as wealthy, and you look at the assets that they own, you're like, oh yeah, those are things we could tax. You can tax returns on the stock market. You can tax the value of someone's home. It's a lot harder to tax the value of a business without causing really significant damage to all the people who work for that business and all the customers of that business.
Absolutely. And when we talk about death taxes, we'll go back to my mythical, Chick-fil-A franchisee. He dies, wants to pass on Chick-fil-A and other restaurants to his heirs, to his kids, who maybe have worked in the business, who know the business, so that it can continue to employ people and feed people. And the government shows up and says, I need several $1 million, right? Because you had 20 restaurants and the founder died. Well, as we were talking about, there's no cash. From the government's perspective, they're really saying, give me 5 of your restaurants. And really what ends up happening is the government is forcing people to sell off things that aren't cash, because almost none of wealth is actual money. And then you're forced to sell it off, frankly, for people who are concerned about monopolies, about investment groups, aggregating together businesses. This is a pipeline to force the sell off of these assets, to force them to be combined under other people, and really for people to ultimately lose their jobs. And, I go back to the story of, this blast furnace. Would you really want the robots in the warehouse of Amazon to be redistributed to your driveway? When people talk about wealth redistribution, they have this notion in their head that it's money, it's factory equipment, delivery trucks, warehouses. I don't want an American Airlines passenger jet redistributed to my backyard. What would I do with that? But, I gets to one other thing I'll say here, which is that I think what these people, socialists and whatnot, talk about is they're fixated on the ownership of capital. What I want to talk about is the use of capital. When you work a job at a place you don't own, guess what? Your pay is increased because you can use the tools in that business. When you walk into a grocery store and buy food, you are actually using the capital, the wealth in the factory that produced the food. In fact, the beauty of this is if you think through Elon and Jeff Bezos, they get to use almost none of the wealth they have. Their wealth is businesses that generate prosperity for other people. And so, capitalism, in my mind, redistributes the use of the capital while preserving its ownership in the hands of the entrepreneurs and innovators who built it, who know it, and who know how to best apply it to make everybody's lives better.
Exactly, and you can calculate this by sort of subtracting the market capitalization of a company minus the worth of the founder, right? So like Bezos with Amazon is a great example. Amazon's market capitalization is about $2 trillion. That means Amazon is worth about $2 trillion to everyone, sort of in general. But Bezos's worth is about 300 billion, which is a ton of money. Don't get me wrong, but it's nowhere near 2 trillion. And the rest of that wealth that his company has created doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the shareholders of Amazon, but it also belongs to the employees and the customers of Amazon who benefit from Bezos's idea.
And again, a lot of people talk about, the workers should own the business they work at. Why would you want to? I would rather be able to own a piece of every Fortune 500 company while working a job somewhere else. And that's exactly what that is, which is that most of the equity in these businesses are in retirement accounts, pension accounts. They're owned by workers who are not trapped into owning the means of their paycheck. They're allowed to invest in businesses on the other side of the world if they want. They will generate a better return on investment. It frees workers, frankly, to build for their kids, for the next generation. But, the other part of this is when we talk about wealth ownership at the level of, 100 billionaires, people like Bezos and Musk, to your point, what we're talking about is really their control over those businesses, the decision making. And, as I said, if you walk out your front door and look around, if you got on a plane, if you could see the entire U.S. from orbit, you'd see $90 trillion of stuff, of buildings and roads and cars and airplanes. It exists. Do you really want to live in the wilderness with none of this? So the question becomes, who makes the decisions about how that $90 trillion of buildings and cars are used? Do you want a government bureaucrat making that decision? Do you want a underwater basket weaving degree holding bureaucrat from Harvard making that decision? No. You want the innovators who built the businesses, who know how to produce value. You want the market to have control over those assets, to decide best how to generate prosperity for all of us. And that's why it's so important that we fight against this idea that the ownership, the control of all the things around us should be handed to a bureaucrat who owes nothing to us, who none of us know, that sits in a building in DC.
And just from a practical point of view, when you really understand what wealth is, you realize just how this can't actually work. I think the airplane was a great example that you gave. The first point about that is, like you said, if the airplane was redistributed to you, it wouldn't be useful. You're not a pilot. You don't know how to fly it. Also, you just don't have a use for an airplane most of the time. Most people don't fly at all. For people who do fly, they probably only do it a handful of times a year. So there's just no reason for them to have an airplane. But of course, if we were really redistributing the wealth of American Airlines, somebody wouldn't get a whole airplane. They would get fractions of an airplane. We would be splitting the airplane up into pieces, which you can do. Airplanes have, thousands, maybe even millions. I actually don't know how many parts are in an airplane, but it's a large number. So you could split up the airplane in different parts and give to each American a little part of an airplane. That's completely useless. Nobody wants a little part of an airplane. The airplane itself is only useful because it combines all these other parts together into something that is greater than the sum of the value of each part individually. And then you put that airplane into American Airlines network of supply people, of maintenance people, of pilots, of flight attendants, of all of that. That is what makes it even more valuable, because you could just have one airplane flying back and forth between two places all the time, and that's one thing. But if you can put it in a network of airplanes with lots of other people, now that airplane is even more valuable. And so this process just keeps building on itself of wealth becoming greater and greater because of combining it with other people, with other ideas, and with other equipment.
And we don't have to leave it to theory to see the negative harm of not listening to this lesson. We have obviously the whole of human history to show the prosperity you're talking about, but we have some really tragic examples. China under Mao, Hitler's Germany, Uganda under Idi Amin. We have real historical examples where people rose to power and said, you know what, I'm going to take the factory. I'm going to hand it to my brother or to one of my benefactors. Or quite literally, Idi Amin did this. I'm going to ban, people, engineers from working on it and actually give equipment to random people. And in every single one of these cases, every single one of them, what you see, as you talked about, is the destruction of wealth. And it's not the financial wealth. It is the destruction of the productive capacity of these businesses, of these things. There were rolling blackouts in Uganda. Obviously, we all know the starvation of tens of millions of people in China, the horrors of the Nazi regime. All of these, and many more tragically, are this result of thinking that wealth is, as I call it, an idle, that it is a piece of cash, that's a thing you can redistribute. We talk a lot, as conservatives, about our heritage, our culture, the things that are passed down generation to generation. And, what I actually offer is capital stock, and how we use it is one of those. When you look at businesses that exist and how we work, what degree you get, what certification you get, what skill you provide in service to others, the physical way we've built our suburbs and cities, where factories and rail lines are, these are all carefully chosen things by generations of the past. These are all statements of our collective heritage as a people, and the knowledge we've acquired, and the history of all the things that we have individually and collectively figured out to be of service to each other, not dictated by a bureaucrat, not centrally planned by an arrogant noble or king or president, but figured out as a community of free people how to really service each other, how to innovate, and how to grow and build our communities. And that is the magic of a free market. And that's the magic of what wealth is a representation of, and really physically what it is, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that building on history is really significant. You point out in the paper how, the average person in England before the Industrial Revolution, the GDP per person at that time was about $1,500 in today's money, held constant for inflation and all the rest of that. So that's 1/10 of the U.S. poverty line for one person was the average for people in England before the Industrial Revolution, and now we're about 56 times wealthier, right? Like it's not just like we doubled the amount of wealth people have. It's not like we made people even 10 times better off. We're talking about, 30, 40, 50, 60 times better off. That's how much that building on the past that you were talking about, that's how much of a difference that actually makes for people in their everyday life.
And, that's also the beauty of the old essay from 1958, I Pencil, which one of my favorites. It's a lot of people's favorites. I put in the report as well. But, he's talking just in a snapshot of time about the humble number 2 yellow pencil and the thousands of people across dozens of countries that it takes to pull together these resources. And, in the way you're talking about, a medieval English farmer had a plow, maybe if they were lucky, an ox or horse, and a plot of land they were working. But think through for all of us, if we individually had to do all those parts of it, we'd be equally as poor with doing it by hand, having to do it all by yourself. But, the meal that you'll eat, ate for lunch today or dinner tonight, there's a combine, there's a $600,000 combine in Iowa that you got to use a piece of indirectly. There's a meat packing facility somewhere. There's an oil refinery that made the gas for the truck to bring that steak to the grocery store. And you actually got to use a piece of it. Bezos didn't, Elon Musk didn't, the people that own shares in FedEx didn't. You, the consumer there, the worker there, you're really the beneficiary of this wealth and of this story we're just talking about, the story of innovation, of how wealth is generated and how these things come together to form every bit of our livelihoods and what's available to us. And, I'll say one other thing about it is that, for people who might be listening who say, well, I'm hearing a lot of discussion about material wealth, but what about the other things in life? What I would offer is really what we're talking about here is being able to produce more material stuff with less time and effort per person. And what do you do with that free time? You can build those other things. Spend it in your church, in your community, with your family. One of the values of free market economics is to free people, not just of burdens and laborious labor, but to free their time, to be spent in ways that can be invested and pay dividends in all of the non-material and important aspects of life as well.
And this just shows why, what's called the labor theory of value just isn't right? Because that medieval worker in England was working a lot harder than people work today, right? Like they were out there in the fields for, at least 12 hours a day, every single day. And they were getting far less, again, like 56 times less for their labor than people do today. People want to say that the past was this amazing time where everybody spent all their time, studying religion and they were with their family all the time, and modern society has ruined that. And that's just completely not right from history. If we look at what people were occupying their time with, again, if you had to be out in a field for 12 hours a day just to have enough food to survive, that means you didn't have that time to spend with your kids, who, by the way, many of whom would have died in childbirth. You wouldn't have had that time to be active in a church community. You wouldn't have had that time to go on vacation with your family or something like that. I mean, all that stuff is a result of increased material wealth, and that is what has helped us to be able to have the time and the ability to do all that stuff, because we don't actually get wealth just from working harder. If it was true that you have more wealth from working harder, it would be better to have less of that capital stock. It would be better to destroy a bunch of the machines, because if we did that, everyone would have to work harder in order to make up for the capital that we lost. That wouldn't make us wealthier. Everyone knows that wouldn't make us wealthier, but that really is the logic of thinking that working hard and labor theory is what determines value.
What I hold opposed to the labor theory of value is what I call the service theory of value. And I think if we all think through everything you just beautifully said, and if you think through the heritage in the West and a lot of other traditions, and certainly in Jewish and Christian ethics, it's arrogant to say, well, I have done, therefore you should pay me, you should appreciate, you should respect it. The question is not, what have you done? The question is, what have you done that was of service to somebody else? What have you done that had that eye towards what can you do that is valuable to others, to your community, to your family, and maybe even to yourself? But to your point, digging a ditch and refilling it is of no service to anyone. And that's really what wealth is a statement of, what profit is a statement of. It's not just moving money around on a spreadsheet. It's a statement that you have used your precious time, energy, and resources to not just do something, but to do something that is truly useful, valuable, and important to you, to your family, to your community, and that perhaps, which is what wealth is, leaves a legacy of prosperity and innovation and growth for the next generation.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much, Richard, for walking us through this, and I think it really helps to think about what wealth is. And I hope listeners can chew on some of these thoughts for a little bit longer, because I think there's really a lot to dig into. But thanks so much.
Definitely a pleasure to come on. Thank you for highlighting and having me here to talk about the paper.
The Trump administration has made the news in the last couple of weeks talking about the government taking stakes in corporations. What that means is that the government would use public money to invest in a corporation, to buy some of the shares of that corporation and acquire an ownership stake. The government has said it has done that with the technology company Intel, taking a 10% stake of ownership in that company. And they have said that they plan to do this with other companies as well, to move towards creating a sovereign wealth fund, or, depending on who you ask, to make sure that taxpayers are getting a return on subsidies that are given to different companies. So those two justifications require two different answers as to why they are not right. The first one about the sovereign wealth fund we've talked about before on this podcast. First thing you need to have a sovereign wealth fund is you need to have sovereign wealth. The United States has a lot of sovereign debt, running deficits of $2 trillion a year. Countries with successful sovereign wealth funds generally do not have national finances that look like that. They take budget surpluses and they invest them in different companies. The most famous sovereign wealth fund among a country that we'd think of as a nice country is in Norway. Norway has a very small population, but it has a lot of oil. And the Norwegian government has been able to take advantage of that fact to run very large government surpluses for many, many years. And it uses those surpluses to invest in one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. It's over $1 trillion. The thing is, Norway's public finances look nothing like ours. Norway runs surpluses. The United States hasn't run a surplus in over 20 years. Norway also has a stable debt to GDP ratio. The United States has an eternally rising debt to GDP ratio, and that ratio is right around 100%. Norway's is lower. Norway also has a much higher savings rate than the United States does. So there's just more money around to invest. And the other key difference is that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is not allowed to invest in companies in Norway. It is only allowed to invest in companies in other countries. They put that rule in place because they understood that this would be a really big temptation for politicians and for the government to get involved in the domestic economy. And you can imagine the people who are more likely to get the investment are going to be people who are nice to the government, and people who don't seek out that favorable treatment probably aren't going to get it. So you can see the United States and Norway really have nothing in common here. The U.S. government is now talking about making a sovereign wealth fund that invests in American companies with borrowed money. Now, investing with borrowed money is, in general, a really bad idea. The only way that you should do it is if you are 100% sure you're going to get a really big positive return, because not only will you have to make a positive return, you'll have to make a positive return and then some to pay back the interest on the money that you borrowed. Is anybody confident that Intel is going to turn around? Does anyone really think that the thing that Intel was missing for all these years was involvement from the federal government? Intel has been struggling in the semiconductor industry, where they used to be the world's leader, and they still are the world's leader in producing chips for personal computers. But on the more advanced chips, they've fallen behind. And it was because of a series of business decisions that they made in the last 10 to 15 years. They sort of missed the boat on smartphones, and now they're sort of behind on AI. Now, they fired their CEO last year, brought in a new CEO. Trump said he wanted to fire that one too, and then apparently changed his mind after he met him at the White House. We should not want to live in a country where CEOs are visiting the president at his house and then getting enormous investments in public money. That's not a free market economy. That's not even a particularly well-run state-controlled economy. Or investments supposedly in the national interest should not be contingent on whether you show up at the president's house. But that gets to that second justification, which is that there is some national interest here in making sure that taxpayers are getting a return on money that is sent to the private sector. Now, one of the obvious ways that the government does that is with things like the CHIPS Act, where they send money to corporations in the form of subsidies for specific goals. I would call those corporate welfare, and I would oppose them. Have opposed the CHIPS Act. I still do. It'd be better if it was just repealed. But given that the government does stuff like that, which it does, even though it shouldn't, maybe taxpayers should get a stake in the company they're investing in. That's the argument that people like Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce, are making. That ownership stake ensures that taxpayers get something in return. Now, there's one problem with that, of course, just right off the bat, which is we don't know if there's going to be a positive return. So maybe you invest this public money and then it is a loss, or the company goes out of business and then you lose the money anyway. But there's another issue, which is that public ownership of the means of production is called communism. There's a word for that. That's what it is. Now, obviously, a 10% stake in one company is not communism, but it is 10% communism in one company. And we should want 0% communism in all companies. Now, there's another case, though, where it might seem a little bit more intuitive to have government control, and that's in the defense sector. The Defense Department's budget is many hundreds of billions of dollars, and most of that money goes, well, a big chunk of that money just goes to paying servicemen and paying for their benefits and so on. But another big chunk of that money goes to private defense companies. Companies like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, places like that build aircraft carriers and build airplanes and build tanks and build guns. The money goes to them, and in exchange, the government gets the weapons that it needs to fight wars. Now, there's always an inherent problem here from a economic point of view, which is that it's a market where there's only one buyer. The market for domestic military supplies only has one buyer, the federal government. Now, that's a good thing, right? I mean, we want the federal government to be the only one that has a military. It would not be good if we had competing militaries in the United States. But we need to acknowledge that because of the unique nature of the defense market, because it's actually a situation where we want there to not be competition among buyers, that the market will always be off from what we would expect in a normal competitive market. In a normal competitive market, you have lots of buyers and lots of sellers, and they compete with each other. Really, sellers compete with other sellers and buyers compete with other buyers. And then you get equilibrium prices. in an allocation of resources that is efficient given the constraints of the market. It doesn't work that way for defense because there's only one buyer. There's no competition on that side. Now, there are still lots of different sellers, although there are fewer sellers now than there used to be in the past. So there's been a lot of consolidation in the defense contractor sphere. But there's still competition on the seller side. And so what are we supposed to do about that? Now, it's tempting to say maybe it would just be better if the government just owned the whole thing. So we already don't have competition on buyers. Let's just get rid of the competition for sellers too. And the government can just make its own defense stuff because at the end of the day, the government's the only one that buys it. So why should it just make it itself? And so the logical conclusion of that might be, yeah, the government should just buy all the defense contractors. Just buy them. Make the ownership stake 100% for the federal government and go that way. Now, there's problems with that. One problem is that is never how the United States has built and supplied its military. The United States has always relied on private sector know-how, technology to supply the military because we believe it's actually important to have civilian control of the military in the form of the president being the commander-in-chief, not career military people being the commander-in-chief, but also in the sense that civilian corporations are the ones that supply the military. So there's a sort of American history issue there that's important. And we know that this works because of things like World War II and the arsenal of democracy. Contrary to a lot of the myth-making after the fact by a lot of progressives, the arsenal of democracy was not built by the federal government. It was built by the private sector. The historian Arthur Hermann is really, really good on this subject. The private sector had the capacity, the know-how, and the ability to crank out hundreds of thousands of airplanes, millions of artillery shells, and just unimaginable amounts of war equipment during World War II. And the federal government's role was actually to remove constraints that were applied to the rest of the wartime economy. Franklin Roosevelt was not going in and micromanaging exactly how these companies produced their supplies. He was too busy micromanaging the rest of the economy. Wartime price controls, wage controls, all the rest of that stuff amounted to the federal government trying to engineer the home front, while the government actually just partnered with private businesses and generally gave them a free hand to build the war supplies that we needed. Again, Arthur Hermann is the historian to read on this. It's very interesting stuff, and it goes against the thing that a lot of people have in their mind, which is that World War II is this amazing victory for the state against the individual. And there's another issue with this idea that the government should own defense contractors or invest in them, which is that lots and lots of companies are defense contractors that we don't really think of as defense contractors. So obviously, Lockheed Martin, obviously defense contractor, General Dynamics, Newport News Shipbuilding, built a lot of the naval vessels. These are all obviously defense contractors. But you know who else is a defense contractor? Southwest Airlines, United Airlines, Delta, all the major airlines, FedEx, UPS, they're defense contractors. Paper companies, pen companies, coffee companies. Military buys all that stuff. Military uses air travel. It uses commercial partial shipments. Should the federal government have an ownership stake in all of that because it's used for national defense? It gets crazy pretty quickly. Now, it still might feel unfair to say that taxpayers are investing this money or sending this money off to these private companies that have their own private shareholders who are getting return, and the taxpayers aren't getting return. But that's wrong. Because the return that taxpayers get for national defense spending is national defense. The return that you get for defense spending is security at home and the removal of threats to security abroad. Now, of course, the military makes mistakes and they don't always get these things right. But the benefit of national defense is enormous. It's a lot more than a dividend payment from Lockheed Martin. The knowledge and security that we have in the United States that we can go outside and go about our day without having to worry about being bombed by some foreign power is extremely valuable. That's the return that taxpayers get on the money that is sent. We know the private sector works better for this stuff. And a quick note about the military-industrial complex, which was a phrase that Dwight Eisenhower used in his farewell address, and he warned about the danger of having an enormous defense sector that takes up a big chunk of the economy. And he was totally right about that. When he gave that speech, United States defense spending was 11% of GDP in peacetime. The United States was not at war when he gave that speech. So in peacetime, defense spending was 11% of GDP. That is crazy. That is way too high. But the thing that people usually forget about that speech by Eisenhower is that we actually listened to him. We took his advice. Defense spending today is a little bit below 3% of GDP, also in peacetime. So as a share of the economy, it's significantly smaller. It's way less than half. It's nearly a quarter of the proportion that Eisenhower was talking about. Now, it's bigger in terms of dollar numbers, but that's just because of inflation. As a percentage of the economy, defense spending today is actually quite low compared to American history. So, we don't need to worry about the things Eisenhower was talking about. We need to worry about it if that number starts going up rapidly. But as it stands right now, we don't need to worry about that. We listened to his wisdom, whether we realized it or not. And it's much better to have a private sector doing our defense than relying on the public sector to do it alone. Another area where relying on the private sector is good is international trade. We've talked about this before a lot on the podcast. And I wrote a piece for National Review magazine looking at this issue of what are some non-market reasons to oppose tariffs. Now, you're listening to an economics podcast, so obviously you're interested in economics, and you probably think that economics has important things to teach the world. I certainly do, and I think it's a useful and important subject. But let's say, for sake of argument, that you don't think that you think all of those supply-demand graphs are a bunch of witchcraft, that none of this stuff matters, the economists are just stupid mathematicians who have these nice little models that work well in classrooms but aren't at all related to the real world. Maybe then tariffs would be a good idea. But as economist Brian Albrecht has said before, the Econ 101 supply-demand graph case against tariffs is actually weaker than a full-spectrum case against tariffs. One problem with tariffs is that they're basically a full employment program for Washington attorneys and lobbyists. Analysis of lobbying disclosure forms by Advancing American Freedom, which is a group led by former Vice President Mike Pence, found that spending on tariff lobbying surged from $1.3 million in the second quarter of last year to $8.8 million in the second quarter of this year. There was also $4.9 million in the first quarter of this year, which suggests that more companies are realizing that lobbying is a good idea. We don't want to create a system where companies think that lobbying is a good idea. Lobbying is waste. The number of tariff lobbying disclosures, which is a government form that lobbyists are required to fill out and is publicly released every quarter, the number of those forms has more than tripled since last year on tariff lobbying, and the average value of a tariff lobbying contract has more than doubled. Now, this is great news for steakhouses in Washington, D.C., where lobbyists will go have a nice filet mignon and probably some expensive whiskey. But who's paying those lobbyists? It's generally big companies. And before we get all mad at the companies for doing this, or mad at the lobbyists for that matter, we need to remember the incentives that they're facing. If a company has a $10 million or $100 million tax bill because of the tariffs, which some companies do, car companies especially, are in the billions on tariffs. If they can pay some lobbyist $400,000 to go knock on some people's doors and make it go away, that's a no-brainer. Of course you're going to do that. And even if it doesn't work, which it probably won't, you only spent $400,000 compared to the $10 million or $100 million that you're losing. So it's worth a shot. And that's what a lot of these companies are recognizing. But of course, if you're a small company, you can't afford that. If you're a small company, your tariff bill might be $100,000 instead of $100 million. But your profit might also be $100,000. You might not have that much to work with. And so $100,000 is a pretty big deal to you. But even if you had the money to pay a lobbyist, they're not going to work for less than $100,000. And so it's not going to make any sense for you to do that. And so this is another reason that we should be concerned about tariffs. They create a situation where big corporations have advantages over small ones. And if you care about manufacturing, which tariff proponents claim to care about, you should really care about small businesses. Because, contrary to what many people might think, small businesses make up most of the manufacturing sector in the United States. Manufacturing companies with fewer than 500 employees employ about 4.8 million workers in the U.S. They're concentrated in the Midwest, and a lot of them import inputs for domestic production. They take parts from other countries, and they assemble them here, employing Americans, and then in some cases turn around and export them, or they sell them here at home. About half of all imports in the United States are inputs for domestic production. So tariffs really get in the way there. Now, if you want one of those exemptions, by the way, one of the things that helps is donating to the party in power. There was a paper that was published this year that found that during Trump's first term, companies that donated to Republicans were more likely to receive tariff exemptions. And it also found that companies that hired revolving door lobbyists who had worked in the first Trump administration were also more likely to receive exemptions. Again, regardless of what you think about economics or trade or any of that, this is a bad system. We do not want a system where people can get ahead by donating to the right political party. And we don't want to encourage more revolving door lobbying than already happens in DC. That's where a lobbyist works for the government, leaves the government, goes works for a lobbying firm on the exact same issue that they were in the government working on. And so there are all sorts of opportunities for corruption, much of which is not technically illegal, but is nonetheless bad for the country. But back to those manufacturing inputs, there's countries such as Canada and Switzerland that have unilaterally removed all of their tariffs on manufacturing inputs because they said, we want to have manufacturing. We don't want to tax our manufacturing companies more than we have to, so we're going to get rid of those. Canada did that under a conservative party government. The United States is not doing that at all. The United States is targeting specific inputs such as metals for extra tariffs, and then the countrywide tariffs apply to all kinds of different inputs. So you don't want a government policy that spurs manufacturing companies to pay attorneys, accountants, and brokers because those people don't manufacture anything. Manufacturing companies should be focused on manufacturing. And because that burden will fall more on smaller companies than on larger ones. It's so hard for a lot of these companies to comply with the tariff rules. I mean, it's hard enough for us as people just watching the news to figure out what rates are on what countries, but imagine having to follow it from a business's perspective and then having to pay penalties for getting it wrong. And so the U.S. has seen large increases in the number of companies using and paying customs brokers to help figure out how to pay the government. This is not economic activity we should want to be encouraging. Customs brokers are just doing their job. It's the government that's the cause of this waste within the economy, trying to figure out how to comply with these trade rules. Then there's the political issues. I mean, Trump's whole domestic political agenda is tax cuts. That was his big law in his first term, and his big law in his second term was extending those tax cuts. But now the White House is bragging about how it's raised taxes with the tariffs. And perhaps more critically, it's baked those revenue increases into its budgeting assumptions. That wasn't a great idea because the tariffs are unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court might order that money be refunded when it gets around to hearing this case later this year. Taxing imports is an enumerated power of Congress. According to court precedent, it can't be delegated to the executive branch without any legislative limits. But Trump is claiming unlimited tariff authority. He says that he can set them for any country, any rate, for any period of time, and modify them at will under an emergency powers law that doesn't include the word tariff and has never before been used to levy them. So there's a constitutional problem too, which we should be alarmed about. And that national emergency declaration is just based on the existence of a trade deficit. Never before in American history has a national emergency been declared over a national accounting statistic. If national accounting statistics can be national emergencies that unlock presidential powers, future Democratic presidents are going to have a lot of fun. They're going to write executive orders to lower the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality. There's plenty of economic research to back up claims that income inequality is harmful to the country. I think a lot of it happens to be bunk, but it nonetheless exists. And there's far more of that than there is research that says the trade deficit is bad for the country. Presidentially decreed wealth tax or inheritance tax could follow the model of Trump's presidentially decreed import tax. And then there's the problem for state governments. Because every person in the United States lives in more than one tax jurisdiction, and those taxes interact with each other. A lot of states have had to adjust their revenue estimates for this year and for next year in response to Trump's tariffs. If there's slower economic growth, that's bad for state tax revenue across the board. And it's especially bad with tariffs for states where imports are a higher share of the economy. Now, the popular imagination, the states that rely on imports are the states on the coasts. But that's not true. The 5 states where imports are greater than 20% of GDP in that state in 2023 were Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. All 5 of those states voted for Donald Trump in 2024. And 9 of the 10 legislative chambers in those states are controlled by Republicans. So it's Republicans who are going to disproportionately have issues at the state level with dealing with these tariffs. Indiana, Kentucky, and Mississippi all have scheduled income tax cuts for this year or next year. And those were based on revenue projections that might not be right anymore. They might have made sense at the time, but now could be in trouble. Remember, states have to balance their budgets. Because of federal trade policy, Republican legislators might have tougher choices than they expected in budget season this year and next year. So it's bad for Trump politically. Now think about foreign governments too. It would be one thing if Trump was targeting adversarial countries, but these tariffs are applying to all countries around the world. And they're doing so in ways that really don't make very much sense from a diplomatic point of view. India is now facing 50% tariffs on its goods coming to the United States, which is higher than the rate against China and higher than the rate against Pakistan, even though Pakistan is very closely tied with China, economics and defense. And the reason that Trump says the tariffs on India are so high is that India buys Russian oil, which it does, but China buys more Russian oil than India does. And China and India are supposed to be adversaries of each other from the United States perspective because the U.S. wants to build its relationship with India to better counter China. Instead, Prime Minister Narendra Modi went and visited China in response to the U.S. tariffs and was looking to increase its trade ties with other countries as the U.S. abandons the field. Trump's also out there setting super high tariff rates on goods from Brazil, even though the U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil, because he's mad about the way that the government there has treated the former president of the country. Regardless of any of that, it just has nothing to do with trade, and it has nothing to do with national security. But Trump is acting on his own here. And so even if the economic theory on the effects of tariffs is wrong, the way that Trump is carrying out his tariff policy is harmful. The normalized corruption, bureaucratic make-work, constitutional vandalism, down ballot damage, and diplomatic head scratchers are in themselves bad for the country. Add to all this that the economic theory on the effects of tariffs is not in fact wrong, and the golden age that Trump keeps talking about looks anything but. Now it's time for the paper of the episode, but before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. From the National Bureau of Economic Research in November 2023 by Robert Barrow and Francesco Bianchi. Fiscal Influences on Inflation in OECD Countries 2020 to 2023. Here's Richard to tell you about it.
So my paper of the episode today is a relatively new paper. It's called Fiscal Influences on Inflation in OECD Countries 2020-2023. It's a fantastically nice academic title, but it was published by Dr. Robert Barrow and Dr. Francesco Bianchi. Barrow, of course, is a Harvard professor. But, what this paper looks to, and I think is a very interesting conversation, is effectively the manner in which inflation becomes a burden on a people, but really when inflation can be a backdoor means of taxation, a means of financing for a government. And what they beautifully look through in the paper is that during COVID, basically most of the major economies of the world printed a ton of money. They spent an enormous amount of money, and they used the money printing and the inflation, basically the monetizing of their debts, as a way of transferring, of using inflation to transfer purchasing power and real value from the private sector, from workers, from families, to the government. And so it's a form of taxation that no one votes for. It's a form of taxation that lives in the minutia of how central banks work and how centralized government debt collection works. But I think it's a wonderful paper showing that it's not just taxation where governments impose a burden, and really, at the end of the day, in my mind, gets to Milton Friedman's old point that the true fiscal burden of a government is its spending, not its taxes, and not any of the individual ways it can finance that spending.
Fiscal Influences on Inflation in OECD Countries 2020 to 2023 by Barrow and Bianchi. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.